Good evening, and thank you for joining us on Facebook and YouTube Live for tonight's Noble Virtual Town Hall, Crisis of Policing and Public Trust. My name is Keenan James. I'm the Deputy Director of Noble, and I will serve as tonight's panel moderator. For over 40 years, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, Noble, has been committed to our mission of ensuring equity in the administration of justice, in the provision of public service to all communities, and to serve as the conscience of law enforcement. We are committed to justice by action. As we prepare to engage in a meaningful dialogue about the crisis of policing and public trust, let's first stop and recognize the brave men and women who serve our communities on a daily basis with honor, courage, and integrity. We thank you, and we recognize that you are upstanding, morally grounded police officers who are here to be a part of the conversation. You're here to be a part of the solution. You're here because you're dedicated to serving your community, and we thank you. Please, if you would, let us welcome Noble's National President and Chief of Police in Durham, Saralyn Davis. President Davis.
Good evening. On behalf of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives and our entire board and our membership, thank you for joining us for this most relevant and critical discussion that we absolutely have to have as we work collaboratively together towards much needed change in our industry. I think over the last several weeks, I think we've all had a myriad of emotions and experienced all kinds of feelings about what we've seen around the country, everything from anger to sadness to confusion and even uncertainty at times about the future of law enforcement. So tonight, I am honored to sit on this panel discussion with some of the top leaders in our field, some of the most accomplished leaders in our field, to really just have an honest discussion about the crisis of policing. And what does that mean? And how do we regain public trust? I have hope for the future. And I know through the work that we're doing in Noble, I know that we can impact change. Thank you. And I hope you certainly enjoyed this presentation.
Chief Davis, thank you so much for starting out this conversation and really setting a tone to get us understanding where we are and where we're going. And most importantly, thank you for serving and being a part of the conversation that we know will lead to actionable change. It was only 6 years ago that our nation was enraged following the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. We marched, we demonstrated, we demanded change. Even President Obama used his position to create the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. The commission produced a national blueprint on modern, effective public safety agencies that emphasize trust, transparency, accountability, technology, officer safety. Past IACP president made a bold statement in October of 2016, recognizing the historical mistreatment of communities of color by law enforcement. We were poised to build community relations, improve officer wellness, and make our communities safer. And while progress was made, the full vision remained an elusive dream. So you fast forward to May of 2020. Our nation, our world really, is shut down due to a global pandemic. And communities, safety, and protection from a life-threatening virus is our #1 concern. That was until we watched 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a video that many of us saw more life-threatening than a virus. The last few months have been extraordinary for Noble and our nation. And out of the tragic deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, an international movement has risen to address systemic racism, bias in policing, and the equitable treatment of communities of color. Protests and demonstrations have started dialogues and initiated changes to address even racially motivated 911 calls, historical monuments, symbols, even sports team monikers. The world, but particularly the US, is embracing the call for conversation, legislation, and action. That is justice by action when it comes to policing in our communities. Tonight's discussion will get into some great topics. We'll talk with leaders from all across the country that bring decades of experience. But more importantly, one of the things that Noble brings to the table is a conscience, a morale, and a compass that will lead us to those end destinations. Joining us as a part of this panel with President Davis is the first woman and African-American chief for the city of Fayetteville, Chief Gina Hawkins, as well as the four-time elected Newport News Sheriff Gabe Morgan. Welcome, Chief Hawkins. Welcome, Sheriff Morgan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I'll start out with our panel as we talk about the subject in and of itself and the crisis of policing. Sheriff Morgan, I'll start with you. How is the crisis impacting you, your agency, as well as your officers?
Well, let me first start out and say thank you. Thank you for Noble. Noble was started the same year I started in law enforcement. And I'll tell you that when we started, some of these issues that we're dealing with today was the reason we got started. So, one, I'm saddened that we're still having this conversation, but like Chief Davis, I am very hopeful. And I will tell you that I sit in a very different position. One, I'm elected, and every 4 years, the constituents have the ability to renew my contract, so to speak. The second thing is, after 16 years in this office, I've had the ability to put a lot of trust in the bank. Many of the things that were outlined in 21st century policing, we live it. And I will tell you that many progressive CEOs, sheriffs, chiefs, we've been living this. And what you will find is in most of those communities, we have been given a little bit of a leeway. I will tell you, we've had demonstration, but we haven't had violence. We've had marches and sit-ins, but we haven't had violence. And we allowed the community voice to be heard, and we continue to allow them to be heard. Where it affects us is the insecurity, if you will, of what the future looks like for our employees. The majority of men and women that come to work in this profession, they start out wanting to do the right thing. They are doing the right thing every day. When you look at the number of calls that we respond to, I will tell you that the comparison or the ratio of complaints versus calls is minuscule. However, we do have a problem. We have a problem in America in that we have become, law enforcement have become the catch-all for everything that goes wrong in society. When it comes to mental health, when it comes to opioid, when it comes to school discipline, you name it. And that's not what we were designed to do. And you couple that with the previous history of law enforcement, that we were part of a system of oppression. When you put all of that together, it's very hard, it's very confusing to know what is our mission. Every day, that mission begins to go what I call mission creep. We keep creeping and bringing more things in. And what we have to get back to is, what is it that our community needs and desire of us? Security and safety is one piece, but all these other things we have to figure out, are we the best people or the best response that's suited to deal with those issues? With that, I'm going to yield because, I see Gina there and I want to get the opportunity to come on in.
I appreciate it. I think that you really opened up the dialogue because that's one of the things. I mean, we're being candid. We're being honest. When we talk about some of the things that you just said, It's what, it's sometimes it said, what's in the job description? And what I signed up to do, that the responsibility of many of our law enforcement agencies exceeds the job description. Now, I'll give it to you. There's always the clause of other duties as assigned. But I'll tell you, if I have some work in my home and I need a plumber, I can't ask him to do carpentry work just because he's there and other duties as assigned. That's not his or her skill set. And so I asked Chief Hawkins, there in Fayetteville, certainly been working towards building that community trust, that relationship that Sheriff Morgan was talking about, that foundation. If the house has a solid foundation, a lot of things can happen around the house, but it's still structurally sound. In Fayetteville, how is the current situation and building that public trust with the community, with the police department there?
So first, thank you for having me. Hello, President Davis. Thank you, Sheriff Morgan. And Sheriff, how you started off, one of the profound things that we have the benefit of doing is not only having relationships amongst ourselves to learn from each other, but to listen from each other, from the experts on the different experiences. So coming to Fayetteville, just like Sheriff Morgan said, knowing the responsibility of the leadership in law enforcement, the importance of doubling down every opportunity to build relationships before the crisis occurs is paramount. So how has the crisis affected our community? One, the same way it's affected across the nation. A big Band-Aid got pulled off of a large scab, and we are now faced with harsh realities that we know have existed in leadership, and especially in Noble, but also the opportunity has presented itself to truly listen to more than our normal people that we've been engaged with within our community. The opportunity for understanding internally and externally, because these are really issues that have been presented that we know we have throughout the nation. We do everything from ensuring that we're accredited, ensuring that we're highly trained, having discussions, addressing things on a daily basis, on top of, like you said, the many different things that we do to problem solve. We have the heart to try to help. We have the heart to problem solve. And ultimately, we're doing everything by taking on, if someone can't do that, then we'll take the responsibility to help and figure out what is the root cause in our community that's causing the bad decisions of crime to occur. So right now in my community, it's been pretty rough, because you have to deal with also across the nation, the reality that morale across the nation is low. And because every time we think that we're taking 3 steps forward, we get gut punched 5 steps backwards by another reality across the nation that we have to face. So this opportunity since May has given us as a department the ability to realize we have to double down on who we've been listening to and invite more people that we haven't heard to hear them. And then I also have to double down with my internal department, because it's a hard reality that we're facing across the nation of what do we need to start training on to improve our ability to reach to the community and build that trust that we have, but to continue it so that we can move forward.
That sounds great. As I take on one of the things you said internally, and you talked about the training, Chief Davis, one of those things that occurs to me is, what's the crisis inside the agency? There are officers that are doing their job every day, and they have the emotional impact of, I'm trying to serve my community. But there are people who just don't like me because of the job that I chose. As the leader there in Durham, how are you focused on that officer wellness, that morale? How do you keep your officers energized and the community understanding that you're still passionate about protecting them?
Yeah, it's actually a balancing act, and it's a tough balancing act too, Keenan. I have to make sure that I'm listening to the community, because the community is screaming that they want change and they want all of these different, innovations. However, the screaming is basically a knee-jerk reaction too from what has occurred around the country and other cities, and not necessarily in my city. Not saying that we have a perfect police department, but the atrocity that occurred, with George Floyd and some of these other situations, the officers are wearing that daily. They're wearing that, they're carrying that cross daily. And not just that, we've got a pandemic going on. We got family members in their ears about their careers and, you know, and second guessing whether or not this is the work for them. And, you know, with all of the mixed emotions that I've had as a chief about this whole thing, you know, I know that my officers are experiencing the same thing. So last week I decided to just bring some of my fraternal order of police folks in a room, you know, on a call meeting just to check the pulse, to ask them, what do we need to do to triage? What do we need to do with these officers so that we can make sure that they're getting through this? This is more than just them being involved in an officer-involved shooting or having some kind of personal issue and they have to go to EAP or, you know, some kind of psychological evaluation. This is a crisis that could potentially impact their entire career and their decisions of whether or not they're going to stay in this career or whether or not they're going to stick it out and help build that relationship. So there is no playbook. And I don't know a chief that says that they have all the answers. Every department is different. And it's almost like you have to stroke and baby, you know, your officers through this because they're going through crisis right now. They're emotional. And of course, it's not popular to be emotional as a police officer. So they're holding all of that stuff in. So there is just a cornucopia of things that are going on right now. And it's important that we check the pulse of the organization and try to be innovative in how we triage.
Yeah.
I certainly understand that. One of the things I often say is your cup runneth over if your cup's not full. And so I think that what I'm hearing from you all is that, you know, we're trying to make sure as our officers, our deputies, that they're whole, because we need to make sure they're able to make sure they do what's right for the community. We want to get all of it. And it's difficult when you're hearing it from your neighbors and your family and just out in your job. You know, how do you keep that going? Because I think at the end of the day, no matter what is going on, I think all of our communities actually support officers present. They really genuinely support. They may want to see some things done differently, but they ultimately say, we want to be safe and we appreciate those that are out here helping make us safe. We want to bring some additional voices to the conversation and to the table. And so we want to add some more perspective. And so we'll bring in Chief Lou Duckmar, who's a past president of IACP, as well as the Commission on the Accreditation of Law Enforcement Agencies, CALEA. He's going to certainly add to this conversation from Georgia. Also, past Norfolk Police Chief and Prince George's County Police Chief and current Sheriff of Prince George's County, Maryland, Melvin High, to join in our conversation. And we also want to bring in an additional component to talk about that community policing aspect. And so we invite Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, who is the VP, the Vice President of Inclusion and Diversity, as well as the Director of the City of Advanced Policing at the University of New Haven. Thank you all for joining in this conversation as well. So what we'll definitely do, I'll start with Chief Duckmar on this go round to say, you know, is the relationship between law enforcement and the community, is it in disrepair? Is it something that can be repaired? Is it too far gone? Is there a timeline on when we can do it? And certainly, Sheriff Hyde, that same question to you, and Dr. Boyd, really interested in your feedback on how, that community perspective as well. So I'll start with Chief Duckmar.
Good evening and thank you. You know, I think it's going to be based on community. As some of my colleagues indicated, there's a lot of anger in many communities that have got the long-term relationships with their citizens. You don't see that anger directed towards the local police department, but you certainly see that anger directed externally at what they see that's gone around the country. I also agree with the sheriff in that, you know, I think I've been around about as long as Noble too. And unfortunately, this is a case of second verse, same as the first. If you recall, we had the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. We had a call for police reform. In the early 90s, we had the Rodney King incident. Again, call for police reform. Then we had Ferguson, call for police reform. Then here we are today. And what's frustrating to me is the same calls for police reform are the same issues for the last 40, 50 years that have played out in our profession since the Watts riots. And those agencies that get it, those agencies that embrace accreditation, that embrace 21st policing, that look as their responsibility of leadership to constantly evolve and improve and become the social ombudsman for their community, to identify those issues and start engaging in a way that make a meaningful change in people's lives, they have the capital that carry them through today. Those that don't find themselves in a struggle where people are now trying to decide, does our police department add value? And when the community doesn't feel like you add value, they're going to look somewhere else for that value.
I can certainly understand that. Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Sheriff High, is there something as far as the community relationship? Do you think it's in disrepair? I think Chief Dekmar just told us, hey, we've been going through this cycle decade after decade after decade. And so the question for the newest generation is, if you've done this before, why isn't it fixed? So is it irreparable? What do you think, Sheriff High?
Well, I think we can always have hope. I think every problem has a solution, so I think we can fix it. And hopefully this time around that we will get to a better fix of this issue, you know. But I clearly believe that our relationship is in serious disrepair with our communities throughout America. And so hard work that lies ahead to fix that. You know, people are angry and confused and looking for good answers, right? They want leadership, as with the coronavirus that everybody's talking about. When we don't have great leadership to address serious, complex problems, then we have a very, very difficult situation. And so that's what we find ourselves in the policing front. I can relate to, certainly in my community and in my personal family, with the concerns that each of them share with me about their safety and how they can look to law enforcement to be a more responsive and compassionate and caring organization that's critical to the well-being of our communities. And so a lot of concern and a lot of confusion in our communities. And so they're really looking for answers. But right now, you know, we've got to break, we got to split. And so we have to, the leaders in law enforcement, I don't believe we can leave it to the politicians, to the legislators alone. They have a role to play in fixing this problem, but it's up to really the leadership in law enforcement. I'm thankful to Noble. Noble has been a real asset to America and to the world in terms of making a difference in policing and helping us to be a better nation and helping us certainly as this profession move forward. I would just end my point on this, that we really need some national standards on some critical issues when it comes to the hiring and the standards for people who can come into this profession. Every profession has strong, difficult standards that people have to undergo and maintain if they want to stay in that profession and then to provide their services to the community. Well, we need strong national standards. I don't think as we go across our country, we go from one state to the next state. So I would want to expect that the police in my community will do the same thing as all the police all across the nation and figure out as citizens, what do I need to do now that I go across a border? And so people are concerned about those issues. So we have a challenge ahead, but I believe it's fixable. I have hope, and I believe the people that you have on the panel this evening, leadership we have of Noble and all of the members of Noble and all of the organizations. I'm a member of IACP and Police Executive Research Forum, and as well as my state organizations. And we're talking about these issues, and we're talking about them a little differently than I've heard in the past. And
well, it sounds like definitely one of the things.
And so we'll fix it.
That sounds like a great thing, and I saw lots of head nods and agreement of saying, "Hey, national standards is something." And I know Chief Dekmar have been a part of Kalia setting those national standards. What's the expectation, so that agencies have a model so that it works a certain way. I think as we were talking a little earlier, one of the things you also said, Chief Dekmar, that I saw a lot of agreement with is it varies across the country. And that means that sometimes what you may see on TV may not be exactly what you all are experiencing in your community, because you may have established a certain relationship. You may have built those community-based relationships that allow you to have that strength. And so Dr. Boyd is one of those that I really want to bring back into the conversation and talk about, we definitely want to put the fix in it. We've talked about the legislative piece and what we can do from law enforcement perspective. But what's that community's perspective, and how do we bring that to the table? Because I think that that's very important to know what the fix looks like from that side of the table too. Dr. Boyd, is it repairable? And if it is, what's the fix look like from a community perspective?
Thank you very much. Let's first acknowledge that Black and brown people have had a tumultuous relationship with the police for hundreds of years. And to say that we can fix it together, I don't know that that's realistic, because the weight of the power differential is often daunting. So from the perspective of the police, building trust and legitimacy through empathy is the starting point of building bridges. And when we talk about what's going on in the community, we need to acknowledge the vicarious trauma that many communities of color are feeling. We have to understand racial battle fatigue, and that many citizens are feeling this after each death, after each negative relationship with the police. So the question is, what can we do to fix this? The fix is building police officer and citizen training together. Joint training between the police and the community, because at the Center for Advanced Policing at the University of New Haven, when we do police training, we bring citizens on board as well for the first few hours, because it's really important for the police to understand the lived experience of the people that they're policing. But it's equally as important for citizens to understand the job of police officers, because we have to do this together. We can't just rely on the police to fix the problem, because, to borrow the phrase from Johnny Cochran in his final summation, who polices the police? Well, if you bring community members and police officers together, we kind of cut down on that negative relationship. When community members and police officers are working together, then we can go to pillar one of 21st century policing, building trust and legitimacy.
Thanks, Dr. Boyd. I think that you raised a really, really important piece of information, and we've talked about it internally, and we've read about some things recently. And so I start with Chief Davis on this question, and it is, how do we change that perception in our communities of the police being what I refer to as social order agents as opposed to public safety agents? Because I think that may be where that historical perspective comes in, is that some people see it as the police were trying to limit groups, and they were trying to isolate groups, and now it's, if you're here to protect me, why is it different from before? How do we change that mentality, just like we've talked about the warrior versus guardian mentality? How we change that public perception? What from your perspective, Chief Davis, what can we do?
Well, I think Dr. Boyd sort of hit it on the head, that we have to really sort of shift in our approach on what the answers are. Police departments are so accustomed to talking at people and giving directives and telling community members what we think they should have or what they need and the training that they should go through, as opposed to allowing them to be participative in the processes. And I know at some point in time, Chief Dekmar probably talk about the relationship building with the community. I actually stole a concept from him, not necessarily the reconciliation work that he's doing, but I thought in terms of how we hire officers who know nothing about the communities that they come to serve. They come from cities and environments where they've never worked around African-American communities, sometimes don't understand culture, don't understand why people have an angst about them. And so what I decided to do is to ensure that every last one of my officers have sort of a history class about the city that they've come to work in. And I haven't gotten so broad to do the reconciliation that Chief Deckard is doing, but that's a start to get to know the people as people, and also share with them your experiences as a person and not an individual in a police uniform. I say it over and over again. We don't wake up in the morning with these uniforms on.
Yeah.
We wake up in the morning as human beings that are members of our community, and that's how we need to go to work sometimes, without the uniform, and find ways to connect with our community members in an authentic way and be more altruistic about the work that we do. So I just want to leave that. I know there's probably some others that want to share in that.
Absolutely. And I think Dr. Boyd mentioned some things, as far as, hey, we've got to recognize that history as we're going into those communities. And you said, hey, you need to learn about the history of Durham and these communities. If you've not been from there, do you know about Hayti and where that community came from, and the legacy and that experience there? And so kind of a round robin for everyone. And I'll start with Chief Hawkins and then go on to Sheriff, both the sheriffs and Chief. How do you see the current situation impacting recruiting? And then as you're now recruiting, what kind of pieces of the puzzle are you putting into not that police officer training, but that understanding my community training? Because you get the job tactics in the academy and through BLET, but you got to get that. I refer to it as the police officer's bedside manner. That comes from that local agency, understanding what's going on there. Chief Hawkins, and then going to sheriffs and Chief Deckmar, definitely want to talk about the program that you have going on there. Chief Hawkins, how do you kind of see the recruiting impact, and how do you integrate into that Fayetteville community?
So the recruiting impact during this time period is really stressful, first of all. Knowing that we already had a challenge of recruiting officers, but now since the crisis of the questionable, when I just started an academy class last week, literally within 7 days, 7 people are gone out that academy class. So I'm down to 13 from 20. But it's the reality that you have to face. Is this job for you? And it's not for everyone. Setting that standard. And then when we do the interview, just like what President Davis said, figuring out who you're hiring, but also the opportunity of that amazing idea of starting the history of this city, educating on that. But another thing, educating on, we were already bringing, last year, racial equity training, just to listen to the facts or important information to be able to start a discussion from the reality of what the crisis we're going through. That's one thing. Once you get in, let's understand each other and let's have those conversations. And then what we're doing in law enforcement is truly, truly unprecedented times. We are having to double down on building that trust, recruiting individuals during COVID-19. So at the same time, we're trying to figure out how to produce training opportunities, recruiting opportunities, developing relationship opportunities during a time when we're supposed to stay away from each other. If we don't have a lot on our plates, but we're innovative. So what are we doing? We're creating opportunities where we now can do it in a Zoom format. We're recruiting and having interviews in a Zoom format. And then we're training on how to change our habits to survive healthy-wise, but also expand that to the community. But it is a lot of opportunities to really think outside the box, as Chief Deckmar said. We all have to be ever evolving with the field that we're in.
Sheriff Morgan, how about you? The recruiting aspect and then integrating into that Newport News community.
Well, the first thing is recruiting is tough. It was tough because the economy was humming along, and sometimes people will come into law enforcement as a last resort. So we had our challenges, and then of course we ended up with this crisis. We ended up with COVID, and like Chief Hawkins talked about, we had to get creative. We are doing interviews by Zoom. We are doing class separation where we have a certain number in one classroom, another in the other. We're using technology to get the training done. But more importantly, one of the things is community work. If you take your recruits and take them to the neighborhood that they most fear, and knock on doors. That is an aspect where they go and they do a simple community survey, talk to people. Most of our recruits today, they're about texting and those kind of things, and they're not communicating one on one with people. Now that with COVID is a problem, but you can still maintain social distancing and still get some of those community walks in. The other thing that I want to talk about briefly is that we have to change the way we've been training law enforcement. Most of us go through somewhere between 21 to 22, 23 weeks. That goes a little further into maybe about 34 weeks by the time you put the FTO time in there. And the only thing that we're teaching them is the basics about how to respond to a call and how to survive. Most of the academies is about how to survive the worst. We don't spend enough time on the social aspect and putting folks through the rigor of relationships. And in the free world, when you look at Germany, you look at Europe, they spend anywhere from 2 to 4 years developing their officers.
It sounds like, so that part of that training is not just that job training we were talking about, but that bedside care. How do you relate to that community and make sure that you understand that historical perspective? Sheriff High, how do you kind of integrate deputies into the Prince George's County community, understanding the history of the community and where your vision for your agency is going?
And we've enlarged our training to cover a whole wide range of issues, everything from de-escalation to bias to understanding mental illness and how you address and respond to people who have some distress of some type. So we've gone beyond the 23 or 24 weeks. Our academy now is about 8 months so that we can add these additional features. And a part of it is that as they're in the recruit academy, they are being taught about Prince George's County and our various neighborhoods and the culture in our various neighborhoods and communities, et cetera. And our part of our training is to help them be good problem solvers and understand the values of the organization, and that when they come out of the academy, to put them with the right field training officers so that those values are upheld and supported, so that they learn and operate and practice the values of the agency and not of the culture. And so we found that trying to extend our training, the additional time has a real dividends, and it pays off in terms of having better performance on our streets.
I love the way that you said, understanding the agency and not the culture. I think that's been one of the things that we kind of hear in the media is that, well, it's that blue line, it's that police culture. And I think that from your leadership perspective, it's no, that culture, we're talking about this agency and this community. The Chief Stegmar, I think there was some Chief Davis was talking about, programs that you have going on, that reconciliation, that model that you looked at. Can you give us a little bit on that model and how it works under your leadership?
Yes, and to the professor's point, listening sessions are great, but as my grandmother said, actions speak louder than words. And so agencies have to define themselves by the things that they do. We, recognize because of our history, which the police department had been involved in a lynching in the 40s. It had never been addressed. There was still that information passed on generation to generation that impacted the perception of the police department in some quarters of the city. We, of course, had the black code and the discriminatory practices that, was widespread through the South. Tuskegee and the Tuskegee experiments less than an hour from here. And so what we recognized is that for our officers to be effective and to understand when they go out on a call and they're greeted with anger, they can't respond as somebody that, responds to anger in a fashion of anger. You've got to be able to take that and then, if you will, jujitsu it and create an opportunity for a relationship that historically hasn't been there. And that is being very active and deliberate in looking for ways to do that. And I can run through 35 different initiatives, but 3 or 4 just real quickly. Record restoration. We were the first police department to sponsor and waive all the fees for young people and old people that have been arrested but not convicted. And that information can be restricted from employers so that they don't see that arrest where you don't even have an opportunity for an interview. We've done, I think, 450 so far. Car care program. Our officers are required when they stop a vehicle for a defect not to issue a ticket, but a coupon as a result of a relationship we have with all the parts stores that give them a 10% discount off the part. Handle with care. We notify the school superintendent's office immediately after dealing with a child that's been in a traumatic situation. So the next morning, that teacher's notified. And when they see that child in the back with their head resting on their arm, they don't look at it as a discipline problem. They recognize this child's been through trauma and we need to handle this differently. I can talk about our homeless initiatives, our mental health initiatives, our civil rights training for our officers.
Yeah, I think you have some great examples. Yeah, great examples, and I think very valuable, because I think that message has to get out to our communities as well. What are those innovative ideas? There are some great things that you just shared with us. Like you said, there are many more, and I'm sure that once we get off of this live stream, or right now, folks are looking you all up and they're Googling it to figure out, what other ideas are there? Because I think that what you're doing is you're building that community trust through some positive things. We talked about procedural justice. If you're stopped for a vehicle that needs a repair, then let's talk about getting a repair, not to penalize you for having that problem. And it's, if it's homelessness, let's try to find a solution to homelessness, not making you a criminal because of your circumstances. And I think that that's what the community is saying is, how do we develop that procedural justice? Dr. Boyd, that takes me right there to 21st century policing. What is, building off of those pillars? We talked about procedural justice. We talked about implicit bias. We talked about officer safety. How do we incorporate technology? I think our law enforcement agencies understand, and they see very good pieces of that they, one, have already implemented, 2, they're waiting to get implemented, or 3, they're waiting to get funded. It's going to fall in one of those buckets. And so for our community, how do they understand that model that we've looked at Noble and said, hey, here's the blueprint. We know what we need to do to move our profession forward. For the community, Dr. Boyd, how can they understand, digest that 21st century task force report, what's in it, and what can they do to help their local law enforcement agency advance those principles?
Let's take a step back. And when we talk about the recruiting, and I'm looking at the different chiefs and sheriffs here, if there are issues between policing and communities of color, reach out to the universities in your area. Reach out to Fayetteville State, North Carolina Central, Bowie State, Norfolk State, Tuskegee, the HBCUs that are in the area that you chiefs and sheriffs are in. That's a good way to start. But the next thing is, when we do police training, there are some things that we kind of missed that I think we should consider. When I got on the job years and years ago, when I went through an academy, there's some stuff that I didn't learn that now I wish I would have known. So now at the university level, if you partner with the university, you get critical thinking skills, you get levels of empathy. More importantly, you get cultural competence. So in order for you to start working with a community, the community has to first believe in what you're doing. Remember, Pillar 1 of 21st century policing says, in order for the community to buy into what the officers are doing, they first have to believe that the officers have the legitimacy to do the stuff that they're doing. So getting people in there that understand this stuff. And for a long time, we were rolling with 21st century policing, but it seems like over the last 3.5 years, we moved away from 21st century. So if you can go back there, pillar number 1. But the flip side is pillar number 6, talks about officer safety and officer wellness. We have to take care of the officers that we have. Because if you notice, officer suicide is starting to outpace officer homicide. So we need to pay attention because officers on the job, they're stressed because there's a lot of really, really good officers that are paying the price for stuff that bad officers are doing. So if we can get officers to go back to being problem solvers and not as much law enforcers, then we have a chance because the good police officer solves problems before they become crimes.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. I think you raised a lot of valuable information there. And like you said, those different pillars really give us some strategies to think about this from a holistic perspective, not just locally or operationally, but how is the whole operation, your whole agency going to achieve success? As we start to look forward, we have various legislative initiatives that are on the table right now. Congress is looking at some bills. We've seen the Justice and Policing Act come through the House. We've seen the Justice Act coming through the Senate. We're seeing that type of movement. But the question that I have for us are kind of all in a real roundabout, and I'll start with Chief Dekmar and kind of work my way around the group is, those legislative leaders, the ball is kind of in their court right now. What do we need to push them to do in order to help the profession move forward? Chief Dekmar?
Well, one of the things they need to do is disengage their relationship with unions in general. A lot of the police accountability processes are compromised because of legislation. You take Maryland, for example, which we certainly don't have this in Georgia, but an officer can be involved in a shooting and doesn't have to give a statement for 10 days. If you show up for a shooting involving a citizen and they say, come back and see me in 10 days, they go to jail. So I think there needs to be some examination of what the legislation is looking to address, and understanding that accountability is a very fragile relationship that is important to the police and the community. The social contract goes like this. The community, through its elected officials, give us the tools to protect them. Our part of the social contract is anytime we use those tools, regardless of who's involved, we have an obligation to explain our actions. And in those situations where that's hampered in any way, it compromises the trust necessary for facts to be gathered because the community doesn't trust the agency.
Appreciate that. Since you invoked Maryland, I'm going to then toss it over to Sheriff Hyde. What would you say to those legislative leaders at both the national level, even state level? What can they do to help move us forward as a profession to achieve some of the great ideas and vision that we have for our community? Sheriff Hyde, you on mute there? We'll let Sheriff Hyde unmute.
Can you hear me now?
There you go. All right, Sheriff, we got you.
All right. Well, here in Maryland, we have the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, and we've had over the last 2 or 3 years a lot of hard discussions about the Bill of Rights and some changes. And so every year some changes get proposed. They're not moving forward. I certainly agree with the editorial in yesterday's LA Times, where it talks about the legislation in Congress, and that it's very modest legislation that every reasonable police officer should be able to support and try to get that done. But it begins a good discussion and good language in the bills about creating some national policy, national standards that will help us to be better. So I hope that legislation moves forward and then moves out of the Senate as well, so that we can move forward with that concept. So I think that's an important thing that we have to do. Our legislators hold the key to how we move forward. There was an earlier question, just briefly, about us enforcing social order law and those things over time. And that's a part of the challenge that's gotten us into some of the trouble we're in, because we didn't really adhere to our Constitution, and we enforced the local ordinances that in many cases was in conflict with our Constitution. So I just want to say that it requires good, strong, hard leadership from us to say this is a piece of local legislation or state law that is not constitutional, and I won't move forward in terms of enacting it.
Thanks. Sheriff Morgan, how about you, from your perspective?
My perspective is it's real simple. I support Chief Dekmar in that we need to have accreditation across the board, some sort of national standard. CALIA is definitely a good way. And if we can't have it across the board nationally, we definitely need to have it at least at the state level. I chaired the accreditation commission from our state here in Virginia for a number of years. And I will tell you that only a quarter of the agencies throughout Virginia are accredited. So one of the first things that we need to do is get everyone, at least on a state level, operating on the same playbook, and then maybe look at nationally what we can do to have more people on the same playbook. Lastly, I will tell you that I also agree with the comment about limiting the unions and having the unions invoke legislation that hamper improvements in law enforcement. The example of not being able to interview someone for 10 days is ludicrous. Yes, we need to treat our officers fairly, but at the same time, legitimacy is important to our survival, and the public needs to understand that we are going to be a force of legitimacy, and officers will be held to accountability no matter what. And so with that, I will tell you I support the legislation that came out of the House. I don't think the legislation that came out the Senate is strong enough, and I will do everything in my power to help push for the passage of that legislation.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And one of the things that we kind of talked about is that accreditation. I know Chief Hawkins, Fayetteville is CALIA certified agency. How does something like that help build public trust? That type of accreditation that the sheriff has talked about and we talked about earlier. How does that help build public trust? How do we get that to get us towards another step of that reconciliation, that rebuilding, that transparency?
It helps build the public trust because you're able to explain that you have some outside accountability to best practices and best standards across the nation, that you have someone else, some guidance. So that's the one way. Doubling down on, I totally agree, accreditation is important. The other thing I think legislation should start looking at is reporting use of force nationally. Has to be something that we're able to gauge in. I know we started the National Use of Force Database collection, volunteer based, but I think it cannot be volunteer. That way we can start collecting the data to start seeing how we can get better professionally, how we can start gauging true information to evolve and be transparent when things occur. So double down on accreditation to include, like what Sheriff Morgan said, even if you can't do it nationally, state standard accreditation is another option. If it's not state, it's nationally, and then definitely making use of force reporting for every law enforcement entity mandatory across the board.
Absolutely. So I'm hearing some definite solutions. You know, what are we going to do? What we're doing as agencies, whether it's accreditation, we're talking about use of force database. We're talking about moving on that 21st century report and implementing those tools. I think all of those things are saying, hey, here's where we are right now. Here's a vision, here's a plan, and strategy for us to help build that public trust. President Davis, we're starting to come towards the end of our conversation, and I go to you and I say, what would you employ our noble leaders, our noble members, our noble supporters in our community, and those officers that are watching and listening to us? What would you say is kind of their role to help us move into this space of public trust with policing?
Well, Keena, we have the amazing benefit of having a power that I think we all just don't realize just how influential we can be in this space today, right now. As people search for answers, about the future of law enforcement, this is not the time for us to sit on our laurels and let somebody else feed to us what we absolutely know must happen in the industry. So I say use our voices, get involved. Even though the community right now, it's very, very sensitive. This is the time to show our leadership and our strength and our courage to say, we know that we're not perfect. And we know that change has to happen, but we can't continue to impact change or try to impact change without having community members involved, so that whatever that product is, it's one that we all agree upon. We owe it to our agencies. We owe it to the industry as a whole. Most of us are coming towards the sunset of our careers. We may not be the ones that see it happen, but we absolutely are the ones that have to initiate this change. And if not now, when? We are at a pivotal point. We're at a turning point. The question is, will we take the turn?
Thank you so much, Chief Davis. I think that, we've heard so many things. And like you said, now we take the opportunity to really turn the ship. We have the momentum, we have the desire, and we have the willingness and the cooperation and collaboration from our communities. I think one of the things that we want to do as police agencies is build that public trust. And right now we have the moment where the public is open their arms, law enforcement is open their arms, they're open their ears, they're open their eyes, and they said, fine, let's go forward, let's move together. And so as we start to wrap up this conversation, first, I thank each of you for taking time out this evening to really talk about where we are. But most importantly, I think the noble piece of this is justice by action. We clearly know where we are, but what are we doing to move forward? We've talked about various opportunities that our listeners and viewers can take back to their local agencies and say, hey, what are we doing to look at some type of accreditation? If it's not national, what are we doing at that state level? What are we looking to address use of force? What are we doing to look at our recruiting efforts? How are we integrating our new officers in our community? How are we trying to embrace the new officers who are coming to our community to help protect and serve us? I think that there are things on both sides of this conversation and this equation that we can take away. And so thank you to Chief Davis, Chief Hawkins, Sheriff Hyde, Sheriff Morgan, Chief Detmar, and certainly Dr. Boyd for adding to that conversation to make sure we talk about what's the past, but most importantly, what's the path to the future. And so I thank each of you for that this evening.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for joining us on this live stream this evening. We hope that it was beneficial, that you learned something new, that you're excited about doing something new, but most importantly, that you're ready to take justice by action. You can learn more about Noble by visiting our website, www.noblenational.org, and spend some time understanding your police leaders. Engage, become a part of the solution so that we can all advance to justice by action. Thank you so much. Look for our next and upcoming events on our Noble website. And thank you again for tuning in.